Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from in the world today. Welcome to this, the first class in the Introduction to Cognitive Behaviour Therapy. My name's Kevin O'Doherty. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. So, some of the learning objectives for the Introduction to CBT as a whole include: what is cognitive behaviour therapy? Exactly what is CBT? We'll be looking at the ABC model of distress, which is the basic starting point in CBT when we either learn CBT techniques or we use those techniques with clients. The ABC model helps us to understand and also to illustrate to clients exactly what the link is between what we think and how we feel. We'll move on in the course to look at what we call cognitive distortions, or often referred to as thinking errors in CBT. And we'll look at the effect of those thinking errors. We'll move on to look at dysfunctional assumptions, or often referred to as life rules, and how those affect the way that we feel. The final part of the CBT model is core beliefs, and we'll be looking at core beliefs, what they are, where they are assumed to originate from, and also the part that core beliefs are assumed to play in psychological distress that we experience. We'll also finally have a look at the whole range of mental health issues and difficulties that CBT can effectively treat. And when I say effectively treat, I mean, according to psychological research, CBT has been shown to be very effective as an intervention in a whole range of mental health issues. Okay, so what is CBT? Well, it's a form of psychotherapy or counselling that was developed by an American psychiatrist called Aaron Beck in the 1960s. And originally, Aaron Beck practiced as a psychoanalyst and was inspired by the work of the world-famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. Now, during his clinical work, Aaron Beck had a number of clients who were experiencing clinical depression. And what he noticed was that using psychoanalysis, some of his patients were just not improving. After quite a number of sessions, they didn't show any improvement in their mood. So their depression didn't seem to be lifting. So Aaron Beck began to have a closer look at those sessions. He looked at the session notes a bit more closely. He listened to the session recordings over and over to see if he could find out exactly why some of these depressed patients didn't seem to be improving. What Beck found was that by listening to the recordings of the sessions and looking back over his session notes, he found that those clients whose depression wasn't improving, whose mood wasn't lifting, they all seemed to have one thing in common, and that was that they had negative thinking styles. So they had very negative ways of thinking about themselves, the future, and the world around them. And they often expressed thoughts during the sessions with Beck, such as, "I'll never get better," "the future is hopeless," "things are hopeless," "I've never been happy in the past," "I will never be happy in the future," "I will never meet a partner," "I will never get a job," etc., etc. So very negative, unhelpful ways of thinking about themselves, the world, and the future. So on the back of those observations, Beck began to have a think about a new range of techniques and strategies and interventions that he could possibly use to help those clients who are depressed, to help them to look at the way that they're thinking about the world, themselves, and the future, to help them see whether those thoughts were helpful, supportive, constructive, and compassionate. And if they weren't helpful, supportive, constructive, and compassionate, Beck was going to help them to find some alternative ways of thinking about the world around them, the future, and thinking about themselves. So cognitive therapy was born. Cognitive refers to the thinking or the thoughts that we have, the thoughts and beliefs. And the main assumption for cognitive therapy in the early days was that the way we think affects the way that we feel, and that further that we can actually take control, learn strategies and interventions to help change the way that we think in order to bring about changes in the way that we feel. Later on, as time moved on, cognitive therapy began to import behavioural therapy strategies that were tried and tested. So behavioural therapy had built up quite a lot of scientific research to suggest that those strategies, many of them anyway, were very useful as interventions for clients who were, for example, anxious or depressed. So cognitive therapy began to take on board some of those behavioural interventions, and thus the term later changed from cognitive therapy to cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT for short. Okay, it might be a good way to understand CBT and this main assumption that how we think affects the way that we feel by using a brief example. So let's have a look at this first example here. Let's imagine that Charles lost his job. He was made redundant after the company that he worked for 20 years had closed. Okay. So from a CBT perspective, what we tend to look at first of all with a client is exactly what happened. We help the client to look at a recent example of an event during which they felt some kind of unpleasant emotion. So, for example, they might have felt anxious, worried, panicky, or depressed in the past few days or the past week or so. So this fictitious example of Charles then, what happened for Charles? He was made redundant. We would ask Charles to list as many of the thoughts that were going through his mind, perhaps during that period where he found out that he'd been made redundant, or immediately afterwards, and when he felt worried, anxious, etc., etc. So we would encourage Charles to tell us exactly what those thoughts were, or to record them on a sheet of paper for himself. So Charles was made redundant. What did Charles think about this? And Charles apparently thought to himself, okay, I'm thrown on the scrap heap, my life is over, I'll never work again, etc., etc. And how did Charles feel as a result? So understandably, I guess, Charles felt quite anxious, quite worried and depressed and lethargic. Now, the idea behind CBT is that we help the client to explore those thoughts and beliefs and to see whether those thoughts and beliefs are helpful, are they realistic, are they evidence-based, are they compassionate, and are they constructive? Do they help the person to feel the way that they would prefer to feel? Do those thoughts help the person to achieve the things that they would like to achieve? And if not, we then help the client to begin to perhaps find more helpful, constructive, compassionate, evidence-based, alternative ways of thinking in order to bring about a better way of feeling. Now, this is not to say that the way that we think about anything at all is right or wrong. Not at all. From a CBT perspective, all thoughts are equally valid. They are neither right nor wrong. But the way that we think about things can be helpful or unhelpful. Okay. So, have a think about this for a moment and perhaps pause this presentation for a while and write some notes down on your thoughts and feelings in relation to this statement. So it's not what happens to us, but rather it's how we respond to or interpret what happens that causes the distress. So central to the idea of CBT is this statement here. It's not the fact that Charles was made redundant, or he lost his keys to the car, or he overslept and he missed an important meeting. It's not what happened that causes the distress, but rather it's how we interpret what happens. It's how we respond in our mind to what happens. It's how we think about what happens that causes that distress. What do you think? You can share your thoughts and ideas on this via the Udemy website, and we can have discussions about it at some point. So, the main idea of CBT then is that thoughts, feelings and behaviour are all interrelated. So, something happens, for example, we have a range of thoughts about that thing that happened. We use a number of behavioural strategies in relation to what happened, and we have consequential feelings. So all three areas within CBT are assumed to be interrelated: thoughts, feelings and behaviour. Okay, to help you to get a better understanding of this basic idea in CBT that what we think about affects the way that we feel, have a look at the handout. It's called an ABCD form and it's on the Udemy website. Have a look at that handout, and in your own time after this first class has finished, record a recent example where you felt an unpleasant emotion. So for example, in the past week or two, past few days even, you may have felt some anxiety, some worry, some stress, or some sadness. Record on the form, write down, just like we did for the example of Charles, in the A column, what happened. Write down what happened, where you were, who you were with, and when this happened. So you may have been on the bus speaking to a friend on your way to work, for example, when you began to feel some anxiety. So just write that down in the A column. In the B column, write down your thoughts and beliefs at that time. So when you felt that unpleasant emotion, write down some of the thoughts that were going through your mind at that time or immediately afterwards. And in the C column, consequences, just write down exactly how you felt at that time. So for example, you felt anxious, worried, sad, upset, etc., etc. Okay? What we'll do in the next session is we'll have a look at some fictitious ABC sheets that have been recorded, and we'll look at some of those thoughts that are assumed to have played a part in the unpleasant emotions. So until then, thank you very much for joining this first class. There are many more to join. So have a go at that ABC sheet and we'll speak again real soon. Thank you very much. Have a good day.